Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Catholics Against Militarism podcast. It is Saturday, June 14th, and Israel has attacked Iran. I was going to make this a cheeky podcast, I just did another podcast with E. Michael Jones, and, the reactions to that were pretty typical. At this point, I'm getting pretty used to being called a heretic, not a Catholic, someone who's in rebellion against the church. I've been called heterodox. I've been called a lot of things because of the things I promote and say on this podcast. So I was going to make a joke of it and have some fun with it, but in light of everything that's going on, I'm just not in the mood. So I thought I would just not even get on camera tonight, but I'm just going to read an article. It's my proof. It's my proof that I am not a heretic, in case anybody out there was wondering. This article is called Christian Conscience and Modern War. And it was an editorial that was published in Civilta Cattolica. Sorry if I'm not pronouncing that correctly. So that's Italian for Catholic Civilization. It's a periodical published by the Jesuits in Rome. But it's the only one to be directly revised and I think reviewed by the Secretariat of State of the Holy See, and it receives its approval before being published. So that means it receives the approval of the Vatican before it is published, and so everything that appears in this magazine is pretty legit and is definitely not heretical. Okay, it's vetted, it's reviewed, it's probably by many different people. You don't get published in this article if what you're saying is not Catholic. Okay, so it was published on July 6th, 1991, and I'm going to read it to you with maybe a little bit of commentary. And, it's just really sad because it was written back in 1991, after the first Gulf War. And now it looks like we may be entering upon our third. It's really sad. So only a few months have passed since the Gulf War, which began in the night between January 16th and 17th and ended on February 28th. Yet almost no one talks about it anymore. A heavy kind of silence has fallen over the war, as if one wanted to remove it in the quickest and most total possible manner from one's conscience. The most curious fact is that while in other cases and in similar circumstances persons hurried to search and to make known what really happened during wars, even now we do not know what really happened in the Gulf War. We do not know, for example, the most essential datum, namely how many Iraqi persons, military and civilian, died. Why does no one let us know this number, neither on the one side nor on the other? Is there even anyone left who will know it? Could the reason be that there was a tremendous and useless, quote, bloodbath, unquote, and it is useful politically, while certainly not morally, that persons should not realize this fact? In any case, the war in the Gulf has raised the problem of modern warfare with extreme dramaticism, not only to the Christian conscience, but to every conscience. Why talk of modern war and not just of war? Because modern war is a reality that is radically different from wars of the past, and thus the theoretical categories and the moral judgments that were applied to wars in the past no longer seem applicable to modern war. Certainly, at its base, war remains war, a moral duel, D-U-E-L, fed on hatred, in which physical violence is unleashed in all its brutality and in a way which attempts to, quote, render submissive, that's a quote from Clausewitz, or to, quote, destroy, that's a quote from Mao Zedong, the enemy. In fact, Clausewitz writes, this is a quote, war is nothing other than a duel on a more grand scale. I'm going to insert my own little comment here. Dueling, killing people in a duel, is very much not allowed in the Catholic tradition. Clausewitz here is saying War is nothing other than a duel on a more grand scale. With physical force, one attempts to render the other submissive to one's will. One's immediate design is to knock the adversary down, with the intention of making him incapable of any resistance. War is therefore an act of violence destined to constrain the enemy to follow our will. Violence, in order to confront violence, arms itself with the inventions of the arts and sciences. Restrictions accompany these actions, and these are worthy of mention, for they are imposed in the name of the rights of persons. But in reality, they do not weaken the force of war at all. Thus, violence, that is, physical violence, is the means. The end is to impose our will on the enemy. To reach this end with complete security, it is necessary to disarm the enemy. That is from his classic work on war. Back to the article. War is thus always an evil, but its evilness appears all the more evident with the slow passage to modern war. If, in fact, wars of the past could be justified as a lesser evil because of their relatively limited harms, that is no longer able to be done with modern war. What occasioned the passage to modern war? As von Clausewitz suggested, even though war always remains a form of violence, quote, it arms itself with the inventions of the arts and sciences, unquote. It thus changes in the slow process in which scientific inventions are perfected, that is, in which they become ever more destructive and murderous. Thus, the introduction of gunpowder brought the first great revolution in the art of warfare, and with the perfecting of firearms, war became ever more lethal. With the introduction of aviation, which could inflict damage throughout a country, with the introduction of submarines, which could strike merchant or military ships wherever they were, with the introduction of long-range guns, which could strike from a great distance, and of armed carriers, which could penetrate deeply and rapidly through lines of defense, war again changed profoundly. Whole nations and whole populations became involved. In fact, populations, combatant and non-combatant, could be the object of attacks because they were close to military targets, or in order to break the psychological resistance of an enemy nation with carpet bombing, or because it was not always possible to distinguish between military and civilian objectives, or last, because it even became possible to consider civilian objectives to be military ones, since they served to nurture resistance and the warfare capacity of the adversary. In this ways, wars which had been local and partial became ever more total in at least three senses. Above all, by the inclusion of the complete territory, population, cultural, artistic, and religious goods, and economic goods of a nation. Then, by involving not only two nations or a group of nations, but many nations, and ultimately the whole world. And last, by the recourse to arms of total and indiscriminate destruction. The first form of total war was the First World War, but it was the Second World War which fully assumed the character of a total war. It is not only that it involved almost all the people of the world, not only that it led to the destruction of entire nations and the physical elimination of millions of persons, but it led to the use of weapons of destruction of the masses, both with the practice of carpet bombing, which aimed at destroying entire cities, razing them to the ground, as happened with the bombing of Dresden, February 13th to the 14th, 1944, and above all with the dropping of 2 atomic bombs in Hiroshima, August 6, 1945, and Nagasaki, August 9th, 1945. In reality, on August 6, 1945, humanity entered into a new period of its history, radically different from those preceding it, the period of total war. From 1945 to the present, with the enormous development in thermonuclear, bacteriological, and chemical weapons, this term has assumed a much more sinister significance than in the past. In fact, if the Second World War, with its funeral procession of over 50 million dead, most of whom were civilians, and with its appalling destruction of all sorts, was total, so much the more total would be any war fought today with thermonuclear weapons, which in their first hours of use would kill hundreds of millions of people and would lead to the destruction of every form of life on a vast portion of the planet. But also, in the case in which thermonuclear or chemical weapons are not used, modern war is always total in its own diverse way. A clear example of this is the war in the Gulf. There, thermonuclear arms were not used, even if the use of tactical nuclear arms was considered in some moments, and even if it was feared that the Iraqis would resort to the use of chemical weapons. But the arms that were used were horrible and destructive enough, according to reliable sources, to cause the death of 175,000 Iraqi soldiers and 30,000 Iraqi civilians, and the almost complete destruction of the civil infrastructure, streets, bridges, and systems of irrigation, and of the industrial and economic fabric of Iraq. According to UN envoys, Iraq was returned to a pre-industrial state. Thus, with respect to war, we are in the presence of a radical change, even a change in its very nature. In other words, modern war is something radically different from wars of the past. This fact, which Gaudium et Spes affirms, quote, obligates us to undertake a completely fresh reappraisal of war, unquote. All right, so that's the end of the first section. Okay, so my problem here is that, well, first of all, I want to say that the key sentence, in my opinion, here is the theoretical categories and the moral judgments that were applied to wars in the past no longer seem applicable to modern war. This is something that just warists will not contend with. This is something that just warists will not admit or even deal with. And the minute you actually try to undertake a completely fresh reappraisal of war, what they do is like dig in their feet and say, no, I'm going to defend this. I will not reappraise this. There is nothing new. The old categories and the old moral judgments still apply. And if you question that, you are not Catholic. You believe in sola scriptura. You are a Protestant. You are a heretic. You are in rebellion against the church. And that is simply not true. The Vatican themselves is publishing an article saying that it seems like those moral categories and those categories that we used to have don't apply anymore. Okay, sorry, I'm getting a little worked up here, but I'm really sick of being called a heretic. All right, next section. What is this completely fresh reappraisal about which the Council speaks in Gaudium et Spes? Evidently, it means that for the Christian conscience, the problem of war is raised in a radically different manner than it has been in the past. So all these, I'm going to interject again, all of these just warists who want to refer to Aquinas or Augustine or whatever, it's like, here the Vatican is admitting that the problem of war is raised in a radically different manner than it has been in the past. We're dealing with something new. They said in the previous section, we are in the presence of a radical change, even a change in its very nature. So we are dealing with something, even though we're still using the word war, it's the same word, the thing that it's referring to has changed. Okay, so blah, 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 blah. To that end, it is opportune to know how the church has thought about this problem in past centuries, in order to trace in a summary way the history of the rapport between the church and war. We will distinguish the practical behavior the church has assumed toward war through the centuries, and the doctrinal elaboration that Catholic theologians, philosophers, and jurists have taken to the problem, an elaboration without much success, but made with the praiseworthy intention of circumscribing and regulating the phenomenon of war. Okay, so what are they saying here? They're saying that they're going to distinguish, we will distinguish the practical behavior of the church, that the practical behavior the church has assumed toward war through the centuries, and the doctrinal elaboration. So practical behavior versus elaboration of doctrine by theologians, philosophers, and jurists. Okay. He also says that there's a praiseworthy intention in that elaboration, though it has been made without much success. What does that mean? An elaboration of the church's doctrinal position has been made without much success, although it had the praiseworthy intention of circumscribing and regulating the phenomenon of war. So we have a praiseworthy intention, but something that wasn't super successful. Okay, back to the article. With respect to practical behavior, this has been different in different historical epochs. During the centuries of persecution, first through the 4th centuries AD, opposition to both war and military service prevailed. Opposition in the first through the 4th centuries AD, opposition to both war and military service prevailed. Once again, I remind you, this is published by the Vatican. Sorry, listeners, in getting all worked up over this, I keep saying it was published by the Vatican, but I don't think it's published by the Vatican. It's definitely reviewed, though, and given the seal of approval by the Holy See. These were seen as incompatible with the spirit of the gospel. I'm sorry, I think that that's what I've been pointing out. And so how come they can say it in the Vatican magazine, but I can't say it? I'm a heretic if I say it. So yeah, just warists. If you're going to call me a heretic for saying that, then I guess that all the Christians that lived in the first 3 centuries were also heretics. So war and military service, opposition prevailed, and they were seen as incompatible with the spirit of the gospel in the first 4 centuries. Quote, "We do not raise the sword against any people, nor do we learn how to make war, because we have become children of peace by means of Jesus, whom we follow as our guide," wrote Origen. Nevertheless, there were Christians in the imperial armed forces, and they did not see an incompatibility between their faith and their military service. Some church thinkers were more benevolent and some more severe in response to these persons. For example, Hippolytus of Rome, 2nd and 3rd centuries, expressed the position of the church as follows, quote, "A subordinate soldier must not kill anyone. If he receives an order to do so, he must not follow it, and he must not take an oath to do so. If he refuses this teaching, he should be excommunicated. The catechumen or the faithful who want to become soldiers are to be excommunicated because they have scorned God," unquote. That's from the apostolic tradition. So it seems to me that when a lot of people say, and I'm interjecting here, that, Christians served in the military in the early church, what Hippolytus of Rome is saying is that serving in the military is one thing, but you can't kill anybody. You can't kill if you're a Christian, and you cannot take an oath that says that you will. And if you refuse this teaching, you should be excommunicated. The catechumen or the faithful who want to become soldiers are to be excommunicated because they have scorned God. In other words, if you're already in the military and you become a Christian, okay, just don't kill anyone. But if you're already a Christian, you cannot go into the military or you are to be excommunicated. Hippolytus of Rome said that. A profound change in the attitude of the church toward the army and military service happened in the 4th and 5th centuries with the Christianization of the Roman Empire. I'm going to inject one more time here, guys. One reason I really like this article is it shows you the changes in these kinds of practical behavior and doctrinal positions over the centuries. So any just warist who tells you that there's some steady, constant teaching of the church on this issue for 2,000 years, that is simply not true. There have been a lot of different kind of iterations of things, as you'll see. Okay, Christians were obliged under threat of excommunication to give military service. A profound change in the attitude of the church toward the army and military service happened in the 4th and 5th centuries with the Christianization of the Roman Empire. Christians were obliged, under threat of excommunication, to give military service, and with the law of December 7th, 415 of Theodosius II, it became forbidden for pagans to be part of the army, which became composed by law solely of Catholics. Such a change is to be understood as resulting from the fact that, having survived the terrible persecutions of Diocletian, Christians began to think of the Christian empire as a realization of the messianic reign and of the Christian emperor as a deputy of Christ. Thus, that emperor's wars could not be anything but, quote, holy or oriented towards salvation. At the same time, from the north and from the east, the invasion of the barbarians was already beginning, of pagans and Arian heretics like the Goths, which was threatening the Catholic Empire. In 410, there was the terrible trauma of the conquest of Rome by Alaric, and thus, sorry if I'm mispronouncing that, and thus Catholics felt obliged to fight for the empire's defense. Thus, the church accepted the army and war, but as a sad, quote, necessity, justified by the, quote, iniquity of the unjust. Quote, to make war may be a joy for the evil, but for the good it is a necessity. That's a quote of St. Augustine by City of God. Okay, now we're moving on to a new era. In pre-medieval and medieval times, the attitude of the church changed again. So here we have an admission in this article published by the Vatican that the attitude of the church has changed throughout time in different eras. And you might say, oh, but the teaching hasn't changed. Well, the attitude is changing. And as for the teaching, I guess that depends on how you define teaching. But we'll talk about that in a second, because apparently the just war theory was never official enough to be an official teaching, but that's all very confusing. We'll get to that in a second. On the one hand, in a society that had become a great Christian republica, the church declared itself against wars in which Christian princes and states would combat one another. Not only did Pope Nicholas I, who died in 867, denounce war as, quote, always satanic in its origins, unquote, but the Council of Narbonne 1045 affirmed, quote, a Christian who kills another Christian spills the blood of Christ, unquote. Thus, in order to avoid wars between Christians, the Church offered to arbitrate in conflicts, and a number of popes did so with success. Pascal II, Gregory VII, and Innocent III, the last of whom solemnly affirmed that the Pope is, quote, sovereign mediator, unquote, on earth. Above all, the Church searched to limit the times of combat by imposing the truces of God, that is, prohibiting combat on certain days of the week, from Wednesday until Monday morning, in certain periods of the year, from Advent until Epiphany, and from Ash Wednesday until the second Sunday of Easter, and on certain feast days, those of Mary, of the Apostles, of St. Lawrence and St. Michael, and the principal patrons, and on fast and vigil days. See Gregory IX's Decretal De Trugia et Pace. So there were these times when people couldn't engage in combat. Interestingly enough, you couldn't engage in combat on the feast day of St. Michael, who everyone seems to think is a big war saint. Beyond this, the Church published norms for the protection of persons not implicated in war, and for the inviolability of certain places, which became centers of asylum for non-combatants. In fact, the Church considered its role in conserving peace among Christians a proper ministry. Also, the Church considered its role in conserving peace among Christians a proper ministry, according to Gregory IV. On the other hand, the Church considered a war, quote, against the enemies of the faith, unquote, not only just, but, quote, meritorious, unquote. I'll read that again. On the other hand, so they tried to discourage and make peace between Christians so that Christians would not be killing Christians in war. However, the Church considered a war, quote, against the enemies of the faith, unquote, not only just, but, quote, meritorious, unquote. Thus, the Church obliged participation in the Crusades as, quote, an affair of Christ, unquote, toward whose success all Christians were obliged to contribute. When a crusade began, Christian princes were required to desist from any private wars among themselves and depart for the crusade, quote, in order to liberate the Holy Land from the hands of the impious, unquote. Fourth Lateran Council, 1215. So my question for the just warists here would be, if there is this steady, constant teaching of the Catholic Church on war, then it must still be okay for Christians to wage war against enemies of the faith. Not only would that be just, but it would be meritorious. In fact, it would be an affair of Christ. So if it was okay to liberate the Holy Land from the hands of the impious back during the Crusades, why isn't that okay now if nothing ever changes? I mean, if the Jews are the enemies of Christ, as I hear people repeatedly say, and the Muslims as well, why don't we go liberate the Holy Land from them now? All the Christians are dead there anyway, most of them anyway. We've allowed them all to be slaughtered or removed in these wars in the Middle East. So all that's left is Jews and Muslims. So if the church's teaching on this issue never changes, we should be able to go wage war against them. So why are you just warists not going over there to liberate the Holy Land from the hands of the impious? I mean, it would be ridiculous to say that the church hasn't changed in respect to this, that the attitudes and what is okay has changed. We would never hear the church say that today. You're never going to hear the Vatican call you to go liberate the Holy Land from the hands of the impious, or kill anybody for Christ and say it's an affair of Christ. No one is going to say that these days. So it obviously has changed, and that means it still can change. In the religious wars of the 16th and 17th centuries, the church was at the side of the Catholic states as they fought against Protestant princes and states. But as political interests began to dominate in the wars among European states, there was a distancing on the part of the church, which became increasingly opposed to war. However, this opposition became absolute only with the popes of this century, from Benedict XV to John Paul II. Okay, so that's the next section that we just finished. Here's the next section. Now, if we pass from the practical behavior of the church to Catholic doctrinal positions regarding the problem of war, it becomes clear that theology has sustained the theory of the, quote, just war, unquote, for many centuries, a theory which, however, never became official, which never was blessed by the magisterium of the church. This theory begins with the presupposition that war is not in itself always immoral. Certainly, every war is a misfortune and brings with it great and terrible horrors, but in some cases war is necessary. There are thus just wars and unjust wars. St. Augustine affirms that a war is just which is fought to avenge injustices, that is, to redress the violation of a right. A war is unjust which is fought for the desire of harm, or for the thirst of power, or for increasing an empire, to obtain riches, or to acquire glory. Done for these reasons, war is brigandage on a large scale. Quote from City of God. The Augustinian doctrine on the just war became the communal patronage of medieval theology, which continued to make more precise its conditions. Thus, in his Decretum, Gratian listed the causes that make a war just. It must be declared by a competent authority, and it must be carried out to recuperate one's own goods or to resist the aggression of an enemy. For his part, St. Thomas Aquinas listed 3 requirements for a just war. 1, the authority of the leader, for it is the duty of the leader to defend the state from both the internal insurrection and external enemies. 2, a just cause, which consists in the fact that those against whom one fights need to be resisted on account of their misdeeds. And 3, the right intention of the one who makes war, who must intend either to promote the good or to avoid what is evil. Thus, even if one has a just cause for going to war, the right intention also has to be present. For if one fought desiring to harm the adversary, for thirst for power or riches, or even if one fought with the cruelty of a vendetta, a war became unjust. Summa Theologica. The sign of a right intention is a searching for peace, since those who fight just wars intend peace. Okay. The doctrine of the just war was taken up again by theologians and canonists of the 16th and 17th centuries, but with a basic difference. Oh, wait, we have a difference. A, quote, just war, unquote, became the, quote, right to war, unquote. That is, the discussion moved from the moral sphere to the juridic sphere. This change of perspective is explained by the fact that in the last centuries of the Middle Ages, nation-states were founded, or better, this was the time of the birth of the modern state, whose essential characteristic was sovereignty. So earlier we had a change of attitude, now we have a change of perspective, due to the fact that now nation-states are sovereign. That is, the modern state did not recognize any power superior to itself, and it held itself to be the only judge of its own interests and its own rights. So that if it held that one of its rights had been violated by another state, or if it held the necessity of making its own rights felt, again, with it being the sole judge of what those rights are, it had a jus belli, which means to say a right to move in war against another state, when it thought that war would be the best manner for defending and vindicating its own sovereign rights. It is evident that this theory of the jus belli it says ius belli. I don't know what that word is. ius belli, belli, implied a permanent conflictuality among states. I'll say that again. It is evident that this theory of the ius belli, it must mean right to war, sorry. So instead of a right to war, I think that's what it means. It is evident that this theory implied a permanent conflictuality among states. The Catholic theologians and jurists accepted the principle of the, quote, sovereignty, unquote, of the state, and thus of its, quote, right to war, unquote, but they searched to delimit and discipline such a right with the theory of the, quote, just war. So at this point, the change in attitude / change in perspective or whatever seems to have less to do with like Christians actually fighting in war, with that big shift in the 4th and I think it was the 5th and 6th century. It went from you couldn't be a Christian and kill in war, and you couldn't be a Christian and go into the military, to you had to be a Christian to be in the military. Very complete opposite just turned on its head there. And then in the Middle Ages, it was like, oh, you don't kill other Christians, but like you can kill enemies of the faith, like Christ. That's like that's what Christ would want you to do. But now they're talking less about just war and more about a right to war. And it's not so much about the moral sphere as it is the juridic sphere. So this idea of the right to war came from with the birth of the modern state. And it's just really interesting because they admit here the modern state did not recognize any power superior to itself. So if we didn't realize that Christians shouldn't be fighting in wars to kill their enemies or, punish the impious or whatever before, at least there was the sense that you were fighting for like a Catholic state, or you were fighting for the Catholic states against the Protestant states or whatever. At least there was this idea of like someone in authority in the Catholic world was above you telling you to do this and that it was okay, or that you would get like an extra jewel in your crown in heaven if you went and did it. But at this point, they're basically admitting the modern state doesn't answer to anyone and doesn't see any power superior to itself. So at that point, you would think, Okay, this might be a good time to call it quits. We can theorize all day about when a state has a right to war, but if that state is not answering to God, then we have a serious authority problem here, and maybe Christians just shouldn't be fighting in the wars of godless states. But nope, that didn't happen. Unquote. According to De Vittoria, the right to war occurs when a war is just, and three causes render a war just. The first is the defense of that which one possesses, the recuperation of goods which have been unjustly taken, and reparation for damages sustained. The second is the punishment of the guilty, that is, for the one who, in violating the rights of another, has committed a wrong, which calls for punishment, since the order which has been violated demands reparation. This must be a violation of rights, which is, quote, certain, grave, and persistent, unquote, to which one is unable to respond with any other mode of restoring justice according to the demands of law. The third cause rendering a war just is legitimate defense against an unjust aggression, since, quote, it is legitimate to repel violence by means of force, unquote. To these three causes, De Vittoria added two essential correctives. Above all, there needed to be a proportion between the gravity of the injustice sustained, or which one is at the point of sustaining, and the damages which will result from the war. Quote, if great evils will be the consequence of a war, it may not be justified, unquote. In the second place, quote, if a war is useful for a province or a state, but causes harm to the entire world or to Christianity, such a war becomes unjust, unquote. This theory of the, quote, just war became, quote, classic in Catholic theology, and one finds it in the manuals of philosophy and moral theology. Okay, next section. What can be said of this theory of the, quote, just war? Above all, one must recognize that it did not intend to justify war. Rather, it intended to limit its frequency and ferocity, assigning very precise and severe conditions and rules in terms of which a war could be called just. The intention of Catholic theologians and canonists in elaborating the theory of the just war was therefore praiseworthy. But the theory had the grave defect of being infeasible, in the sense that a war could not be conducted according to the criteria for a just war. Let me read that again. The theory had the grave defect of being infeasible, in the sense that a war could not be conducted according to the criteria for a just war. In fact, in order for a war begun for a just motive, and just in the sense to avoid becoming unjust, the following conditions had to be met. It could not produce grave evils. It could not cause damage to the whole world. It could not be conducted with ferocity, and it could not inflict harms on the adversary which were greater than those necessary for obtaining the ends for which the war was begun. But these conditions of a just war were and are unobtainable, since by its very nature, war is conducted with brutality, causes damages which are greater than any advantages which could possibly arise in terms of justice and rights, and it tends to inflict harms on the adversary which are much more grave than those required to reach the end for which a just war is conducted. In reality, war has its own logic, which is to inflict the most severe harms on the enemy, more severe than those necessary for reaching the end for which a war is fought. The motive of such ferocity, that of war itself, is that in war one does not want only to reach the end for which the war is declared, but it wants to destroy the adversary in a way that it will not again be able to recover and thus constitute a future danger. I'm going to interject here again. Is this not what we see Israel doing? Is this not what we see happening in Gaza and now spreading throughout the Middle East? And in this article, they're basically saying that just war is not, it has a grave defect of being infeasible, because the conditions of a just war are unobtainable, since by its very nature, War is conducted in a certain way and it has its own logic. And so the grave defect of the just war theory seems to be that it does not acknowledge the true nature of war. All right, so back to the article. So if again, I don't think that anybody can be called a heretic for pointing out the problems in the just war theory, or recalling Christians to a time before, there was a time when it was okay to fight in the military. Okay, back to the article. This explains the progression of the war in the Gulf, undertaken for a, quote, just motive. The liberation of Kuwait from the Iraqi invasion by its own inexorable logic, it moved at first to a systematic destruction of Iraq, on which 90,000 tons of bombs, apparently, were dropped. Bombs which made for an incalculable number of dead and wounded civilians. Then it moved to the destruction of the Iraqi army. Destruction of the Iraqi army in order to ensure that Iraq will not be able to pose a military danger in the future. In this way, the liberation of Kuwait has cost the destruction of a country and the deaths of hundreds of thousands of persons. I'm going to pause for another second here. It's just amazing to me that not 10 years later, we went into that country and destroyed it all over again. And I remember hearing from some of the soldiers who went over there, like how backwards it seemed, and how, they didn't have a whole lot of, some of them didn't have a whole lot of respect for the people that lived there. And it's like, well, their country had just been freaking decimated only 10 years before. And here we come again, marching through. Okay, back to the article. In this way, the liberation of Kuwait has cost the destruction of a country and the deaths of hundreds of thousands of persons. At this point, is it really any longer possible to talk of a just war? Or must one not instead say that just wars no longer exist? Since even when just causes are at stake, the harms which wars bring, by their very nature, are so grave and horrendous that they may never be justified in conscience. Even more, wars are not necessary and inevitable, since the injustices to which wars are supposed to provide remedies are able to be addressed with other means no less effective than war. It is not true, in fact, that war is the extrema ratio, since there are always peaceful systems for settling conflicts, if only there is the will and patience to use them. In reality, to say that war is the extrema ratio is often an attempt to justify one's own desire to make war. But that which is most troubling in the theory of the just war is that the condition of the just cause, most of the time, serves to give moral and juridical cover to a war which one intends to carry on for ends which are very different than those which were declared. Obviously, I think we can see this happening with Israel right now. But that's a whole different topic. This suggests that the theory of the just war is not sustainable and is to be abandoned. In reality, with the only exception of a war of pure defense in the presence of an aggression in act, it can be said that just wars do not exist and that there is no right to make war. So this part is slightly confusing and slightly frustrating to me because, he's like, or whoever wrote this is like, the just war theory it's unobtainable, it's not sustainable, it's not feasible, it should be abandoned. He says all these things, or the writer says all these things, and then with these 15 words, in reality, with the exception only of a war of pure defense in the presence of an aggression in act, it can be said that just wars do not exist. Well, with those 15 words there, you just carved out the loophole that is basically the whole just defense theory, that you can drive a nuclear bomb through. But, I think what he's saying is that the just war theory is different than the exception of a war of pure defense. I don't understand really what the distinction is there that he's making. It's a little bit confusing, and I wish he wouldn't say all those things and then go back and reinsert the loophole. But maybe he had to put that in there to get it approved. So what he seems to be saying is that a just war is not possible, but a war of pure defense is still acceptable or something. But I'm going to deal with this idea of defense in another very short video, because assuming that everybody knows what defense means, it seems like so straightforward, but it's not. It's not. It's very confusing, and it leads to a lot of confusion. So I really wish they had not inserted those 15 words in here. But he must be saying that a war of pure defense is somehow different than the theory of the just war. In reality, he says, with the only exception of a war of pure defense in the presence of an aggression in act, it can be said that just wars do not exist and that there is no right to make war. Though the right of legitimate defense is admitted by both Pope Pius XII and by Vatican II, at least in certain circumstances, and in the lack of an international authority capable of peacefully settling conflicts. Quote, since human freedom is capable of unleashing an unjust conflict harming a nation, it is certain that such a nation may, in certain determined conditions, rise up in arms and defend itself, unquote. The council adds, quote, war has not ceased to be part of the human scene. As long as there is no international authority with the necessary competence and power, governments can not be denied the right of lawful self-defense once all peaceful efforts have failed, unquote. Gaudium et Spes. It is to be pointed out again, however, that a war of legitimate defense becomes illegitimate, quote, when the harm it brings are not proportionate with those of the injustice, which would otherwise be tolerated, unquote. In such cases, quote, one may have the obligation to suffer the injustices, unquote. Pius XII, 1954. Moreover, even in a war of legitimate defense, arms of total destruction may not be used. And above all, arms which escape the control of persons and thus are not able to be limited to the strict demands of defense may not be used. Okay, so in case the development of the modern state, which is totally godless, didn't, compel the church to say, hey, Christians, you can't fight in war anymore. If that wasn't a good enough reason to say it, you'd think that this would be, because they just said that arms which escape the control of persons and are not able to be limited to the strict demands of defense may not be used. Arms which escape the control of persons, is that not where we are now? I mean, already the wars that are happening in Israel and Iran, they're not really being controlled by people. They're not people holding the weapons in their hands and obeying all these rules. They're basically just drone wars already. And how long before there's not even anybody sitting in a room controlling them? It's all done through artificial intelligence. So isn't that the point at which the arms escape the control of persons? And do we think that at that point, the church might say, hey guys, okay, no more Christians participating in war. First of all, these are wars fought by godless states. Second of all, the arms are not in control of people. I'm sure that's just around the corner. I'm saying that facetiously. I wish I could believe that, but I don't think it's true. But if we didn't say it before, now is definitely time to say it. Their use must be rejected, quote, as immoral, unquote, since, quote, in this case, one is no longer treating of a defense against injustice and of a necessary safeguard of legitimate possessions, but of the annihilation, pure and simple, of every human life within the realm of action. Such is not permitted in any circumstance, unquote, Pius XII, 1955. But that which has definitively placed the just war theory in crisis, and even the war of legitimate defense, as Pius XII observed, is the advent of modern war, which in its very nature involves arms of destruction of the masses, and which therefore escapes the control of persons. In reality, the wars of the past were fought with arms that caused limited harms and were controllable. But modern war is fought with arms of destruction of the masses, which escape from human control, thus killing and wounding soldiers and civilians. Parenthetically, it is an allusion to talk of military operations as, quote, surgical operations. But modern war is fought with arms of destruction of the masses, which escape from human control, thus killing and wounding soldiers and civilians. It is an allusion to talk of military operations as surgical operations, destroying military and purely civil targets, even when there is not a direct aim to target civilian populations, and targets as a means of demoralizing the enemy. Moreover, I think I'm on the right page. Moreover, modern war is not able to be limited in its harms, but carries with it the destruction of nations, which is practically total. It can lead to the appalling massacre of a civilian population. One thinks of the destruction of Hamburg and of Dresden, or Hiroshima and Nagasaki, with the launching of 2 atomic bombs, held to be necessary to subdue the enemy, which already had begun the war, soiling itself by means of tremendous crimes. In reality, modern war unleashes a violence which, in the very use of modern arms, moves beyond every limit. Even if it is now said that the use of so-called conventional arms is valid in certain cases, it is clear from what has happened in the Gulf that these have reached an enormous power of destructiveness due to the power of technological innovation. One need only think of the white phosphorus bombs that seem to have been used against Iraqi soldiers fleeing Kuwait. But modern war leads to use of thermonuclear, chemical, and bacteriological arms, or at least there is always the danger that it will lead to use of such arms, since, as the Second Vatican Council affirms, quote, every act of war directed to the indiscriminate destruction of whole cities or vast areas with their inhabitants is a crime against God and humanity, which merits firm and unequivocal condemnation, unquote. And since, quote, the hazards peculiar to modern warfare consist in the fact that they expose those possessing recently developed weapons to the risk of perpetuating crimes like these, and by an inexorable chain of events of urging men to even worse acts of atrocity, unquote, Gaudium et Spes. And since blah, 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 the hazards peculiar to modern warfare consist in the fact that they expose all of that, unquote, it is necessary to conclude that modern war is always immoral. Next section. But beyond being immoral, war today is useless and noxious. On the one hand, it does not resolve, unless superficially and momentarily, the problems that cause it. Pope John the 23rd said that, quote, in these days in which some glory in atomic force, it is irrational to think that war is an instrument useful to redress the violation of rights, unquote, Pacem in Terris. And on the other hand, not only does war not resolve problems, it aggravates them, making it almost impossible to find a solution and creating new problems that are even graver. A war becomes the premise of future conflicts and wars, especially since the peace with which wars are concluded is imposed by the winner on the loser with violence, and thus becomes seed for a new war. Thus the seed of the Second World War was the Peace of Versailles, which put an end to the First World War. In reality, a war almost never concludes with a real peace, but leaves behind itself a trail of hatred and a thirst for revenge that will inevitably explode as soon as there is an occasion. In this sense, human history has been an interminable succession of wars. With war, in fact, one primes a spiral of hatred and violence which is extremely difficult to stop. Therefore, war is useless, since it does not resolve problems. It is noxious because it aggravates them or renders them unsolvable. Just how true this is, unfortunately, the Persian Gulf War has shown us. Certainly, Kuwait has been liberated, and international legality has been restabilized, but at what price and with what results? The price has been the destruction of the invading country of Iraq and the economic ruination of the invaded country of Kuwait, the reconstruction of which will cost over $100 billion, according to The Economist. The results have been the slaughter. I think I heard today, a little interjection here, someone said today that in the past 25 years, we've spent $10 trillion on our wars in the Middle East. The price has been the destruction of the invading country of Iraq. The results have been the slaughter of Palestinians in Kuwait, and one imagines of Iraqis there, carried out by the Emir al-Sabah since his return to Kuwait. of civil war in Iraq with the massacre of Kurds and Shiites, the environmental devastation of a very large portion of the Persian Gulf. All of this without mentioning the huge military cost of the war, calculated by the U.S. Congressional Budget Office at over $2 billion. That was 35 years ago. And all beyond this, none of the very serious problems of the Middle East, that of the Palestinians, that of the Lebanese, of the Kurds, seem to have become easier to solve as a result of the war. On the contrary, these and other problems born of war have been aggravated, and their solution appears all the more problematic. It thus seems clear that not only is war immoral, but for its uselessness and the disasters it produces, it is irrational. This explains the attitude which the Church has assumed in the 20th century in regard to war, and which has been expressed in the absolute condemnation of war, and thus in moving beyond the old problematics of the just war and the holy war for the defense of the faith. This attitude indicates a growth in the Christian conscience about the absolute immorality of war. I'm going to stop right there before we move on. I think this is a very important section for those accusing me of heresy. Okay, so the Church is assuming an attitude in regard to war, okay, which has been expressed in the absolute condemnation of war. Okay, so they're absolutely condemning war. They have moved beyond the old problematics of the just war and the holy war. What's interesting here is that they're inherently admitting that the just war is problematic, which is what I've been saying and what people accuse me of heresy for saying. Oh, how dare you critique the Church? How dare you criticize the teachings of the Church? It's right here. They're admitting it was problematic. In fact, they're saying the old problematics of the just war and the holy war. And keep in mind, this is always in quotes. I know you can't see the article, but I'm trying to put key passages up for you on the screen. Just war is in quotes, holy war is in quotes. So the same idea of us going to kill enemies of the faith, in the Holy Land or whatever for the crusade, like that is lumped, like we all know we don't do that anymore. We've moved beyond that. And what's so interesting is that they're putting that together with the just war, that the just war too is something we are moving beyond. And then it says, this attitude indicates a growth in the Christian conscience about the absolute immorality of war. So we're going in the right direction. We're growing in our understanding. So my question is, why have the just warists completely missed the memo? Like, I could turn this on them, since they're always calling me a heretic, and I could say, well, we're moving beyond the problematics of the just war, and so if you still believe in that, you're the heretic, because you're not thinking in line with the mind of the Church. But see, I'm not mean like that. And I'm not going to call anyone else a heretic, and I'm not even going to blame them for still believing in the just war, because they look it up in the catechism, and it's right there. Okay, and so the fact that these just warists have completely missed the memo is not really their fault. And I don't want to point fingers, but we do have dedicated teachers in the Church who are responsible for teaching us about this. And so, yeah, it's not their fault if they miss the memo. That's why I do this podcast. I hope they watch it, and I hope that they too can grow in Christian conscience about the absolute immorality of war. Thus, in 4 important documents, the Church has formally condemned war. In Pope Benedict XV's encyclical Pacem de Munus, 1920, in Pope John XXIII's encyclical Pacem in Terris, 1963, in the Pastoral Constitution Gaudium et Spes, 1965, and in Pope John Paul II's encyclical Centesimus Annus, 1991. Quote, "No, never again war, which destroys the lives of innocent people, teaches how to kill, throws into upheaval even the lives of those who do the killing, and leaves behind a trail of resentment and hatred, thus making it all the more difficult to find a just solution of the very problems which provoked the war. Just as the time has finally come when in individual states a system of private vendetta, reprisal, has given way to the rule of law, so too a similar step forward is now urgently needed in the international community, unquote. But in the same moment in which it condemns war, the Church affirms that, quote, peace is possible, unquote. It is, quote, not a dream, nor a utopia, unquote. And thus today it is necessary, quote, to go resolutely toward the absolute proscription of war, unquote. Humanity is thus not condemned to the, quote, factuality, unquote, of war, but is able to be free itself from war's, quote, necessity, or better, from its, quote, slavery. So here I'll point out that when they say humanity is not condemned to the factuality of war, but is able to be free itself from war's necessity, putting necessity in quotes, or better, from its slavery in quotes, this directly contradicts St. Augustine. Earlier on page 3, it says, thus the Church accepted the army and war, but as a sad necessity, quote, necessity is in quotes, justified by the, quote, iniquity of the unjust, unquote. Now here they're quoting Augustine from City of God. To make war may be a joy for the evil, but for the good it is a necessity. So the Church accepted the army and war, but as a sad necessity. What do we have here? Telling us that we can free ourselves, we are able to be free itself from war's, humanity can be free from war's necessity. In other words, it's not a necessity. It's not a necessity anymore. We don't see it like that anymore. In fact, what is necessary? The whole idea of necessity has changed. Today, it is necessary, quote, to go resolutely toward the absolute proscription of war, unquote. So I guess we're just doing away with that old idea of St. Augustine's. But you will see people just worse all day long quoting St. Augustine and his stuff on war. But obviously, it is changing. It has changed. They just missed the memo, or they refuse to admit that the memo has been issued like a bazillion times from the Vatican in the last 100 years. Then there is a motive which is even more important and radical for the Church, which drives it not only to condemn war, but also to make of itself a promoter of peace. For it must announce the gospel, which is a gospel of peace. Therefore, the proclamation and promotion of peace among peoples is a part of its own religious mission. Thus, when the Church talks of the necessity of its working for peace and of speaking against war, it does not invade the strictly political realm, but stays within its within its religious and moral mission. So much so that if it did not do this, it would be unfaithful to the gospel of Jesus, which proclaims peacemakers blessed, since they will be called children of God. For Jesus, in fact, human beings are brothers and sisters to each other, since they are children of the Heavenly Father, and therefore the concepts stranger and enemy, which lie at the base of the ideology of war, have been overcome. In its statements, the Church is doing nothing more than restating the gospel call to solidarity among human beings. So it seems to me here that we're going from this talk of just war, moving beyond the idea of the just war, the problematics of the just war, in other words, and the idea of the holy war against enemies of the faith. We're moving beyond that, but we're not really going beyond. It seems to me that we're going back to the beginning, because it says we are a promoter of peace, and then it goes back, we must announce the gospel, which is a gospel of peace. So we not only condemn war, but we announce the gospel. And this is part of its religious mission. And so it's not like we're moving beyond anything. We're kind of just getting rid of all this, like, I don't know, dross that we've accumulated, these like barnacles or something that have grown, it's like, because we're going back to the beginning. At least that's what it seems to me, when opposition to both war and military service prevailed in the 1st to the 4th centuries, when these were seen as incompatible with the spirit of the gospel. Okay, and I'm quoting from earlier, in the article. So now it's not really new. We're just kind of going back to the original attitude. It's almost like as war has become more and more, as its nature has become more and more obvious to us through the destructive capacity of technology, it's become unsustainable and all those infeasible and all of those other things. What's also interesting here is that Jesus, in fact, human beings are brothers and sisters to each other since they are children of the Heavenly Father. So instead of saying, well, let's have peace among Christians, but you can go kill enemies of the faith, we're all brothers and sisters as Christians, but they're not. They're killable, right? It's like the definition of brothers and sisters is expanded from just Christians to everyone. And of course, it's always been that way. But because of the ideology of war, it seems that things kind of got confused for several hundred years. I also think this article is great because it calls ideology of war ideology of war. It's not natural law. It's called ideology of war. That will become more important in the next section. Next section. Thus, the church condemns war and wants peace. But what does it mean for the church to combat war and want peace? To combat war means to combat the ideology of war. In practice, it means to combat the idea that war is able to resolve problems that are at the base of conflicts. It means to combat the idea that war is an extrema ratio, because in practice, an extrema ratio does not exist, since it is impossible to prove that all the means for avoiding war have been considered and put into practice, even less than to prove that the one who decides that there is nothing else to do except go to war has not already decided to go to war, and having undeclared reasons for doing so, is only waiting for an opportune occasion to begin such a war. It means combating the idea that war is necessary or inevitable, and that peace is not possible. Finally, it means combating the idea that wars are fought for noble motives, for establishing universal orders of justice and of peace, or simply for correcting an injustice, since for the most part these noble motives, which certainly are present in some persons, serve for others as a way of giving a juridic and moral cover to the true motives of wars, that are motives of political supremacy and economic interest. In other words, combating the ideology of war means unmasking war, showing what it really is, what its movements and its results are, showing, among other things, that it is always the poor and the weak who pay for war, either when they assume the ranks of the military or when they remain in the civilian population. I'm just going to interject right there. If this is the job of combating all of these ideas, if that is the job of the church, then then there's nothing wrong with doing any of that, right? I mean, I love this part about combating the ideology of war, means to unmask war and show what it really is. But so often when you do that, people don't appreciate it. They actually think that you're being disrespectful. You're being disrespectful to the people who fight wars to point out how they're total BS. They really don't want you to do that. The just warists find that threatening, honestly. They find it threatening to unmask to show what it really is. It seems that they become threatened by that, because if you show what it really is, then you're somehow chipping away at the sacred cow of the just war theory or whatever. Instead of doing this work that we're supposed to be doing to combat war and to combat the ideology of war, instead of doing that, we're still throwing like parades on Memorial Day and like thanking everybody for their service and like treating it like it's something that is necessary and something that is noble. Meritorious, I believe, was the word that was used. I'll say that I really also like this term, ideology of war, because so often the just warists, well, first of all, they came up with a name for people who, it is fair to call some people pacifists, but usually when just warists call someone a pacifist, it's relegating them to this sort of like sideshow of lunacy and it's as if pacifism has been a word that has been created, and pacifism just means being against war. You do not need to be a follower of Christ or any even sort of religious believer to be against war. Anybody can be against war. And most people are against war. So pacifism, when they call you a pacifist, it is derogatory, and it's like putting you in this little box, and it's kind of like, it's very dismissive. It's a way of dismissing you. So I think it's important to call them just warists, because when they call you a pacifist, they're saying that you're an ideologue. You have an ideology that is not compatible with Christianity. That's basically mostly what they're saying. So it is good to call them just warists, because and they will tell you that their philosophy is philosophy and it's based on natural law. But I like this article because it's saying that there is an ideology of war. And it's not just based on natural law. In fact, it's so interesting that in this entire article, the words natural law, I don't think they even come up. The just war is referred to as a sort of problematic theory, and it's based on an ideology. And that ideology needs to be unmasked. So it's important that, the just warists, because if you do start to try to unmask things, they will instantly try to fall back on natural law. And the ideas of natural law need to be distinguished from the ideology of war, which is probably a project that I'm probably not cut out for, but somebody out there is. So somebody take that and run with it. Back to the article. But the church is not content to condemn war. It wants peace. But what peace? Not a peace founded on injustice, on violence, on terror, on mutual suspicion, but a peace founded on justice, on solidarity, on reciprocal trust. The church holds that there can be no peace where situations of grave injustice are perpetuated, where the just aspirations of people for freedom, for self-determination, for having a homeland, for living a life which is worthy of human beings are all negated, where the sense of frustration and of hatred and vendetta among peoples, nations, and continents only grows, where reciprocal trust is missing, and where peace is founded on an equilibrium of terror and is only sustained in an unstoppable race of arms, whether conventional or nuclear. These are the reasons why the Church, in declaring itself decisively against every war and in favor of peace, calls for the overcoming of situations of injustice which exist today in the world and which are only portents of future wars. Especially worthy of mention is the radical injustice constituted by the dramatic condition of the increasing economic poverty of the southern hemisphere of this planet. This condition cannot be healed if, among other things, a limit is not placed on the production of arms, whose cost of production is beyond imagination. To call to mind only a few of the arms systems used in the Persian Gulf, one Tomahawk missile costs over $1 million. He goes on to list a bunch of missiles and how much they cost. This is a waste of an immense amount of money that could and should serve to eliminate the poverty of millions of human beings who are dying of hunger. Finally, it is necessary to address the local situations of injustice, some of which are particularly explosive, such as the situation of Lebanon, of the Palestinians, of the Kurds, and of the Cypriots, and the problem of security for the nation of Israel. Last March 4th, Pope John Paul II, while opening a Vatican meeting of the Catholic patriarchs and presidents of the Episcopal conferences of the nations involved in the Persian Gulf crisis, recalled that, quote, peace and justice walk together, unquote, and that there will be a, quote, just and lasting, unquote, peace in the Middle East only if the following problems are resolved: the effective respect of the principle of territorial integrity of states, the solution of the Lebanese and Palestinian problems, the regulation of the commerce in arms, and accords aiming at disarmament in the region. In reality, peace in the Middle East has not at all returned with the victory of the Allies over Iraq. Peace needs to be constructed patiently in a negotiation that would give satisfaction to all the just demands of the peoples of the area. A peace, therefore, in justice, in solidarity, and in mutual trust that could eliminate political and social abuses and forms of imperialism and economic exploitation. To construct such a peace is an enormous task, but it is the only way to ensure that the war in the Gulf is not only the beginning of an interminable series of horrors.